She arrived at official engagements in evening gloves and a cigarette holder, looking like she'd stepped out of a Cecil Beaton photograph. The public loved her for it. Journalists followed her. Gossip columnists tracked her social calendar the way military analysts tracked troop movements. In the 1950s and early 1960s, Princess Margaret was the most watched woman in Britain after her sister, and arguably the more interesting one. The people who cleaned her rooms had a different view. Craig Brown, whose 2017 biography, Ma'am Darling, remains the most forensically detailed account of Margaret's private life, won the James Tate Black Memorial Prize for exactly this reason. He let the evidence accumulate without editorializing. What accumulates is a portrait of a woman who treated glamour as a public performance and hierarchy as a private weapon, pointed primarily at the people with the fewest options for pointing back. She was born on 21st August 1930 at Glamis Castle, 4 years after her sister Elizabeth. As the second daughter of the Duke and Duchess of York, she began life fourth in line to a throne that was never meant to be relevant to her. Then Edward VIII abdicated in 1936, and Margaret's world reorganized overnight. She moved to second in line. Every adult around her dropped into curtsies when she entered a room, and her entire identity became structured around being nearly, but not quite, the most important person present. She would spend the next 66 years navigating that position, not always gracefully. The constitutional reality was stark. Her sister was queen. Elizabeth had a function, the most visible function in the country. Margaret had a household, a title, a civil list allowance, and no defined purpose that anyone could meaningfully articulate. Author Ingrid Seward, writing in My Mother and I, describes Margaret as feeling that the Queen was so good and perfect, while she was very much the opposite. Royal historian Andrew Morton, in Elizabeth and Margaret, is more direct. Margaret's frustration revealed a resentment and indifference that seemed almost ill-mannered. The frustration needed somewhere to go. It went downward. By the mid-1950s, a specific daily architecture had taken shape at Kensington Palace. Craig Brown documented it with the precision of a time and motion study. At 9 o'clock in the morning, breakfast arrived in bed. Margaret ate it there, then spent the next 2 hours reading the morning papers, chain-smoking, and listening to the radio. The newspapers, once read, were left scattered across the floor. That wasn't a personal lapse. Picking them up was the maid's job, and the maid was well aware of the distinction. At 11 o'clock, a bath was drawn for her by her lady's maid. Not run, drawn. Margaret stepped in when it was ready. An hour later, she moved to her dressing table for hair and makeup. Then, clean clothes. Brown notes she never wore any garment more than once without having it cleaned. At 12:30 in the afternoon, she came downstairs. The first thing she reached for was a vodka and tonic. It was noon. The routine ran like this most days, according to Brown's research, from the mid-1950s onward. Lunch followed at 1 o'clock. 4 courses, served from silver dishes, half a bottle of wine per person, a cheese board with 6 varieties. This wasn't an occasional indulgence. This was Tuesday. This was every Tuesday. What makes the morning routine significant isn't the extravagance itself. Royal households were built around service. That part wasn't unusual. What the routine reveals is the specific texture of how that service was received. The newspapers left on the floor communicate something. They communicate that retrieving them was someone else's category of problem, and that the someone else didn't require acknowledgement for solving it. Staff were functional architecture, not people who warranted the friction of social recognition. That philosophy extended into the corridors. Tom Quinn's 2025 book, Yes, Ma'am, The Secret Life of Royal Servants, contains testimony from a former Kensington Palace maid who worked there in the 1950s. She told Quinn that she was instructed, from the moment she joined the household, that she wasn't to make eye contact with Princess Margaret. If she passed Margaret in a corridor, she was to step aside, look at the floor, and remain silent unless spoken to. These weren't written rules posted in the servants' quarters. They were delivered verbally by senior staff as received wisdom. This is how things work here. The maid also recalled that if any of Margaret's personal belongings had been moved without her permission, Margaret would berate a servant in front of others, which could be humiliating. The eye contact prohibition is psychologically distinct from ordinary aristocratic formality. Formal household protocol existed across all royal residences, but prohibiting eye contact doesn't regulate behavior. It regulates personhood. It requires the other person to perform their own invisibility, to make themselves officially not there while physically present and working. That's a different category of rule entirely. And Margaret was smoking through all of it. She smoked approximately 60 cigarettes a day, according to multiple accounts, a number that required, given her social calendar, a certain logistical solution. Peter Russell served as a royal aide from 1954 to 1968, 14 years of direct proximity to the royal household. In the documentary Royal Servants, Russell described his experience of working for Margaret as difficult. He then provided the specific example that made the understatement concrete. Russell recalled, "Of course, at a banquet or a big social occasion, it meant you had to dance attendance on her all night long. Possibly to be just standing to her left or right with an ashtray, so she didn't have to look to see where she flicked her ash. 60 cigarettes a day. She didn't bother looking for an ashtray. A person stood there instead. This wasn't ceremony. It was convenience, the purest possible expression of a worldview in which another person's time and physical presence were simply resources to be consumed without acknowledgement. The servant holding the ashtray wasn't someone she was thinking about. That was precisely the problem." The account doesn't stand alone. An individual who encountered Margaret in her capacity as Chancellor of Kiel University documented the same practice in a non-palace setting. A lady-in-waiting was always present with an ashtray into which the princess would knock off the ash without looking. Two separate settings, the same behavior, the same absent-minded non-relationship with whoever was holding the thing. The consistency is the point. Russell also reported, in the same documentary, the specific form of address Margaret required from her staff. "Ma'am, darling." Not ma'am, not your Royal Highness. Ma'am, darling. A hybrid construction requiring whoever was speaking to simultaneously perform aristocratic deference and personal warmth, wrapped into a single phrase on demand. Craig Brown used it as the title of his biography precisely because it encapsulates her psychological contradiction so efficiently. She wanted the hierarchy enforced and the intimacy performed, at the same time, by people who had no choice in the matter. What made it genuinely strange was that it wasn't just for staff. Brown documented that even her friends, people who chose to be in her orbit, were expected to use the same address, ensuring no one around her, regardless of relationship, ever quite forgot her rank. Staff members reportedly gave her a different name among themselves, Her Rude Highness. The nickname is documented in multiple secondary sources without a single identified originator, which is itself informative. It spread through the household the way things spread through closed communities, because it described a recognized and shared experience. Anne de Courcy, writing in Vanity Fair, provides the architecture behind the name. Margaret treated those who looked after her inconsiderately and with maddening demands that often caused endless extra work. De Courcy also documented what happened on the day of Margaret's wedding to Anthony Armstrong Jones on the 6th of May, 1960, as Margaret left for Westminster Abbey. Lord Adam Gordon, the controller of the household, stood at the top step and bowed. "Goodbye, Your Royal Highness." As the glass coach pulled away, he reportedly added, out of earshot, and we hope forever. Years of service reduced to a goodbye and a private wish. The marriage to Anthony Armstrong Jones, who became Lord Snowdon after their marriage, matters here not as a romantic story, but as a household weather event. Two volatile personalities sharing a palace created an atmosphere that staff absorbed directly. Former footman David John Payne, who served at Clarence House in 1959, was sufficiently unsettled by what he witnessed that he wrote an insider memoir, the first of its kind. The Queen Mother's lawyers immediately filed for an injunction. Payne fled Britain and published in Europe and the United States. The American edition carried the cover line, "The book the royal family banned in England." The injunction tells you something about what the memoir contained. The Snowdons formally divorced on July 11, 1978, the first royal divorce since Henry VIII, and by then, both of them had accumulated a history of affairs that made the proceedings something less than a surprise. The household staff experienced the marriage differently than the gossip press did. Quinn's sources describe a domestic atmosphere of unpredictability that fell hardest on the people lowest in the hierarchy. Margaret's moods were documented as highly variable, and in her household, variable moods had a downward direction. Morton writes that Margaret's attitude revealed a resentment and indifference that seemed almost ill-mannered, even toward her senior social circle. The gradient down to junior staff can be readily calculated from that baseline. Morton also documents what happened at a state banquet in 1957 when a government minister complimented Queen Elizabeth on her evening dress. Margaret's response, delivered across the table, was, "Darling, that does show your bosom too much." On a separate occasion, during an afternoon tea visit from the Queen herself, Margaret was in what Morton describes as a curmudgeonly mood. She insisted on listening to the Archers on the radio, and when the Queen attempted to speak, Margaret silenced her with "shh." The Queen of England, told to be quiet during a BBC radio program about a fictional farming family. Anne Glenconner was present that day and handled it with the practiced grace of someone who had spent years managing exactly this situation. She told the assembled company, "Ma'am, the Queen is here, and she can't stay all that long. Would you like me to help pour the tea?" She switched off the radio, poured, and left the room. Glenconner is the most important witness in this story, precisely because she isn't a disaffected employee. She served as lady-in-waiting from 1971 until Margaret's death in 2002, 31 years, and she genuinely loved her. In 2019, Glenconner described Craig Brown's Ma'am Darling as "that horrible book," and declined to name it by title. Her 2019 memoir, Lady-in-Waiting, which spent over 30 weeks in the Sunday Times Top 10, was written partly as a corrective. She wanted to document the wit, the warmth, the humor. She writes about laughing with Margaret more than with almost anyone else in her life. Even Glenconner couldn't fully paper over it. Her memoir documents the bickering between Margaret and the Queen Mother during weekends at Royal Lodge, described as bouts of bickering in a slightly strained relationship. One would open the windows, the other would go around shutting them. But beyond that domestic friction, there's a pattern confirmed by multiple independent sources. De Courcy specifically documents Margaret's frequent rudeness to her mother, up to and including telling the Queen Mother, "Why do you dress in those ridiculous clothes?" Peter Russell in Royal Servants independently recalls Margaret making the same critique with the same phrasing. Two separate witnesses, the same words, the same target. What Glenconner's loyalty ultimately reveals, without intending to, is the scale of what everyone else was absorbing. If Margaret shushed the Queen, criticized the Queen Mother's clothing with open contempt, and issued directives that long-serving courtiers visibly shook their heads at, then the daily experience for a maid collecting newspapers from a bedroom floor, or a footman standing with an ashtray at a formal banquet, positioned to her left, invisible for hours, was something that documentation has only partially captured. The psychological explanation is available, and the biographers make it plainly. She was the spare. She had no formal role. Her marriage was volatile from early on and collapsed publicly by 1978. Her constitutional position gave her privilege without purpose. Brown's account and Morton's analysis both point to the same pressure valve. The household was where her authority was absolute, and she used it absolutely. That explanation is real. It's also not the same thing as an excuse, particularly when the targets of the authority were people with no recourse. The contrast with her public image was large enough to constitute a genuine split in the cultural record. Netflix's The Crown gave Helena Bonham Carter the role across 2 seasons, a performance built on sympathy, on the tragedy of the thwarted rebel, the brilliant woman boxed in by convention. The constraints on Margaret's life were real, and the loss of Group Captain Peter Townsend in October 1955, when she issued a statement declining to marry him, under pressure from the Prime Minister and the Church of England, was a genuine wound. The show earns its pathos. What it doesn't show is the maid stepping aside in the corridor and looking at the floor. The broader documentary record is equally selective. The standard template for a Princess Margaret documentary allocates considerable time to Townsend, the wedding dress, moustique, the glamour of the Snowdon years, and moves through the household dynamics quickly or not at all. Tom Quinn had to interview former staff 60 and 70 years after the fact to record what their daily reality had been. David Payne had to leave the country to publish his account. Peter Russell spoke on camera in Royal Servants, and even his testimony is primarily known through press reports rather than the documentary itself reaching a wide audience. The memoirists and biographers who did the work of documentation, Brown, Quinn, Morton, de Courcy, were sometimes framed as antagonists by Margaret's defenders. Glenn Connor's dismissal of Brown's book as horrible is the clearest example. But Ma'am Darling won the James Tate Black Memorial Prize in 2018, one of the oldest literary awards in Britain. The receipts were judged credible enough for that. What the documented record leaves you with is a woman of genuine intelligence and genuine charm. Glenn Connor's evidence on that point is sincere and substantial. Who also maintained, for decades, a household structured around the daily performance of her own supremacy. The morning routine, the eye contact prohibition, the ashtray, the "ma'am darling." These aren't individually catastrophic acts. They form a consistent system. A daily architecture of hierarchy applied to people who had signed on to serve a royal household and found themselves maintaining one person's insistence that her rank be felt, personally, in every room she entered. The people who served her kept quiet for a long time. The tradition in royal households ran strongly against public disclosure. Payne's flight to Europe in 1960 illustrated exactly what happened to those who broke it. Quinn spent considerable time locating former staff willing to speak on record, and did so decades after the relevant events. Russell gave his documentary testimony and was specific, but his account circulates mainly through press reporting. Glenn Connor told her version in 2019, and it became a bestseller, which is the version most people encountered. The result is that public memory of Princess Margaret remains largely organized around the image she curated: the cigarette holder, the evening gowns, the thwarted romance, the celebrity friendships. Craig Brown's book title reads like affection, until you understand it was a command, issued to people with no option of declining. What remains in the record, because a handful of former employees and a few meticulous writers made sure of it, is the other half. The 2 hours of newspapers left on the floor each morning, the hour-long bath drawn by someone else's hands, the vodka at noon, the footman standing at the edge of a state banquet, arm extended, ashtray offered, not looked at. History tends to be organized around the people it builds monuments to. The people who maintained those monuments, who drew the baths and retrieved the newspapers and stood for 14 years at the left elbow of a woman who never looked down to see them, kept their stories in reserve until someone thought to ask. Subscribe for more stories like this.